Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome indeed to Environmental Change Institute, colleagues from across the university and perhaps from elsewhere. This is the first of a set of series that we will be discussing how food systems operate at different spatial resolutions. I'm interested in that. My name's John Ingram. I'm setting up a food systems research program here in the Environmental Change Institute, and the issue of spatial resolution is very important. It affects governance structures, it affects interactions with environment, it affects all manner of perceptions. And so, given that we've got some leading lights visiting Oxford over the next week or so, I thought it would be great to capitalise on them being in town because they're all thinking about this issue at different spatial levels. And so we have a set of seminars. The next 3 weeks, they'll each be on a Monday, same time, same place, you're all welcome, which we will be going today from the national level down to subnational, down to major cities, capital cities, down to a provincial city, and we're going to be using this one, Oxford. So you're all welcome to come back. We can discuss the series a little bit more afterwards. But I'm really pleased to welcome Elin Röös to kick this seminar series off. Elin's visiting Oxford for 6 months, come from Swedish University of Agricultural Science, and has been studying environmental impacts in food systems for a very long time, particularly in relation to diet. In her PhD, she was thinking about the limitations and the uncertainties of how one assesses particularly environmental aspects of food systems and diet. But before that, for about a decade, she was working in the IT industry. So she comes at this from a very different perspective to what perhaps many of us are coming from, which is great. So, Elin, welcome indeed. Over to you to give us a seminar. Afterwards we can have some discussion, and then you're all invited to a glass of wine or juice or something afterwards. So, welcome indeed, and Elin, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to this seminar. I will give a little bit talk now on this study that I worked on last year. And as it says here, it was about designing a sustainable diet for Sweden. That's what we tried to do. So I will talk about this study, and I will start with a bit of a background so you can understand the approach we took when doing this. And we're just about to finish now the paper that we will send to Food Policy on this project. So I'm very interested in your views and thoughts about our approach and what we did here. And if you have any questions during my talk, you're happy to interrupt me, and I can answer any questions you might have. But first, a bit of a background. And the starting point for this project is then, of course, that the current food consumption patterns are unsustainable. And I think in the last 5 years, there's been hundreds, really, of studies showing this in different ways. And I'll just show you one example here. From a study that me and some colleagues did a couple of years ago, where we looked at the climate impact and the land use from the recommended diet in Sweden and the current diet in Sweden. And I want to tell you a few words about this recommended diet, because I'll come back to that later. And this recommended diet is a diet developed by the Swedish Food Agency. So what they did is that they looked at the current consumption, and they looked at the nutrient requirements, and they adjusted the current consumption patterns so they would be compatible with the nutrient recommendations. So they needed to decrease some things, and they needed to increase a few things. So mainly decreasing alcohol, sugar, meat consumption, and then increasing vegetables and so on. So it's an example of a diet based on the nutrient recommendations. So that's the recommended Swedish diet. It's just an example of a diet that resembles the current eating patterns in Sweden. And then the yellow bar there, it's the current consumption. And what we did in this study was also that we defined a sustainable level of climate impact from the diet and a sustainable level of land use from the diet. And of course that we can discuss that a lot, but what we did was that we looked at the emission space when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, and then we said that about half of that could come from food production, because the rest of it needs to, we need to save some for transport, heating of the house, and so on. So we said, so that's the sustainable level here of climate impact. So we normalized that to 1. And the same for land use, and here we used the per capita cropland availability in Sweden. So we took the available cropland in Sweden and divided it upon the Swedish population, and that's the sustainable land use here. And then we assessed the climate impact and how much land that is needed for the production of these diets, and as you can see here, it's clearly unsustainable when it comes to climate, and here when it comes to land use, it's a little bit better, but still this current diet is above the sustainable level. So yeah, and if you look a bit closer at these numbers and what causes this, you see of course that meat is the main problem, and that's I would guess not a big surprise to you here in this room. And I think it's quite clear also if you look at the climate impact per kilo of protein, you see that for lamb, beef, cheese, pork, chicken and egg, it's a lot higher than for here the legumes and the cereals. And you can really find all plant-based foods down here, all the vegetables and fruits and everything. But of course the reasons for this are mainly 2. When it comes to beef, lamb and cheese, of course, we have the methane emissions from the ruminants. And so this is how it could look. But there's actually something wrong with this picture. I don't know if you can... Is there someone here who... There's lots of knowledgeable people here, maybe?
Coming out the wrong end.
Yeah, it's coming out of the wrong end. So there's something, the methane is actually coming out this way, so it's something a bit fishy with this picture. But so that explains why these are so much higher than the rest here. But also the pork, chicken and egg are a lot more climate impacting than the legumes and the cereals. And that is of course due to the inefficiency of animals. You need to put in a lot of energy into an animal to get the meat out. So those are, well, physical or biological limitations when it comes to producing food using animals. And that's also why it's so important to also think about what we're eating and not only how we are producing it, because there's only we can only limit this to a certain extent. We can increase the feed efficiency and we can reduce the methane emissions, but only to a certain extent. So we also need to think about what we eat. Another study that looked at this is here is from Peter Scarborough from Oxford here. So what they did in this study was that they used a large cohort of people, 60,000 people, and they looked at what they actually ate, and they categorized these people into high meat eaters, eating more than 100 grams of meat per day, medium meat eaters, eating between 50 and 100 grams per day, and then low meat eaters, below 50 grams of meat per day, and then fish eaters, vegetarians and vegans. And they also calculated the climate impact from these diets. And here you can see also that the vegetarian and the vegan diets are much lower than the meat eating diet, or the diets with meat in them. So if you look at this, you could then draw the conclusion that if a vegetarian diet or maybe a vegan diet would be the best way forward if we really want to reduce the emissions from diets. But then there's some complicating factors why this might not be the best way forward. And one thing is that if you think about a vegetarian that consumes dairy but not meat, when we produce dairy, of course there will be some meat produced. So that's maybe a bit inconsistent then or maybe not best resource use to only consume this bit. And it's the same of course with eggs, where we also have hens and so on. And another thing is that there are some types of land. This is a picture from Sweden, from a semi-natural grassland, where it's really difficult to produce food without using animals here, because it's either too stony or too dry or too wet. So the only way you could produce food here is really using grazing animals. So if we would go for a totally vegan society, then we would not have any food production from these types of land. And maybe we need also to produce food from grasslands. And in addition, some of these grasslands are very rich in biodiversity. Lots of plants and animals that have adapted to these types of ecosystems that only exist here. So if we don't keep these open, then we will also lose biodiversity. I will come back to that because that's very important in Sweden. So maybe we need to do this a little bit more sophisticated than just saying, you know, vegan or a vegetarian diet is the best one. So we thought about this and we tried to set up some principles for the sustainable livestock production. And so these are the three principles that we based our study on. And first, then that the arable land or the cropland should be used for the production of plant-based food for humans. So no feed production really on arable land or cropland. And that livestock, we should feed them biomass that is not suitable or not wanted by humans. So if we have biomass from grasslands, for example, we could feed that to livestock. But also, although, as I showed here, the only food that can be produced here is from grazing animals, this land also has some alternative uses. Because sometimes the discourse is like this land is totally free to use. But you could let this land rewild, for example, and that would benefit biodiversity in some situations. Or you could use it for bioenergy production. So there are some alternative uses. So that's why in this we added this third principle, that if the livestock production on these grasslands can be motivated by other reasons than food production, for example for biodiversity conservation, or for providing livelihood for poor. I mean, in some areas grazing animals are very important for poor people, where they provide not only food but also transports and draw power and so on. So we thought that if there are other reasons than just producing food, you could use this grassland for livestock production also.
Are these meant to be global principles or just for Sweden? What was the thinking?
The thinking was that they could be applied to a region. We applied them to Sweden, but you could apply them to bigger regions or smaller regions or so on. So that's what's the thinking. And I think it's not really something new. There's been lots of authors who have suggested, this way of thinking, that let's produce, food for humans on cropland and then let the animals eat what we don't want to eat. I mean, not competing, not giving grain to animals, and animals should not compete with the things that we eat. So I mean, that's nothing new really. But what's not been done is to take this a step further to see if we apply these principles, what kind of diet would that give us in some region? And it's, of course, depends very much on where you set this region. And also Tara Garnett, who is here in Oxford in the food systems groups also, she wrote a paper introducing this concept of producing livestock from ecological leftovers in 2009, and this is really what this is about. Let's restrict the production of livestock to what we don't really want or can't eat. So that brings us to the aim of this project now, that was to design then a diet for Sweden based on the principle of ecological leftovers for livestock production, and also to evaluate the sustainability of this diet. So if we apply these principles that are like raised from many different people, what kind of diet will it give, and is it a sustainable diet? So we set the boundaries here to Sweden now, and as I said, you could you could think about setting these boundaries differently, like setting them to Europe or even a smaller region. And I think that's an interesting discussion, just like John said, the scale on which you apply this. And this is a map of Sweden, and this is the cropland. And in Sweden we have very little cropland. Only 8% of total land area is agricultural land, actually. And it's the red parts here. So our starting point then, looking at Sweden, was again on this pasture or this semi-natural grasslands that we have. Sweden used to be covered with these grasslands, millions of them, millions of hectares, but they have been planted now with very monoculture spruce forests. So we have only 1% of total land left covered with these semi-natural grasslands. And this is the most threatened ecosystem in Sweden. Most of our threatened species can be found in this type of land. So from a biodiversity conservation point of view, these are very, very important in Sweden. So we said then that we want to preserve all of these. It's 400,000 hectares, and we'll produce milk and meat using dairy on this land. So that was the starting point. And then we constructed different scenarios. I will only show you one today, just to reduce confusion, on how to use this land and the other cropland, and what kind of diet that would give us. So looking at this milk and meat production from these 1% or 400,000 hectares of semi-natural grasslands, we calculated how much beef, milk and cheese that would give us, and then we divided that upon the people, and this is the per capita amount that we got. So beef meat, 69 grams per week, and this is the reduction from the recommended diet, and this is the reduction from the current diet. Are you with me? Yeah. So, and then when it comes to milk, 1.5 deciliters per day, also a major reduction here from current and recommended diet, and about 1 slice of cheese per day. That's what could be produced from these semi-natural grasslands. Then we moved on to the cropland, and according to the principles now, they should be used for production of plant-based food for humans. And then we thought, since in Sweden we have more land per capita than is available globally for food production, so we thought we should not only produce food for the 10 million living in Sweden, we should also produce a little bit extra to take our responsibility for food security. So let's produce food then for 13.6 million, and this is based on the global land availability. So taking all available agricultural land and then dividing it on the global population. And then Sweden has the responsibility to feed this many people. So we then calculated how much of all vegetables and cereals and potatoes and everything we needed for this. But what we also needed to do, because we're in Sweden, and this is actually moving away a little bit from the principles, is that we need also to produce some winter feed for the grazing animals, because animals in Sweden can't survive the whole year just outside. So we need to produce some forage so they can eat in the winter. And then we also needed to produce some cereals for monogastric animals, and I will explain why we needed to do that in the next slide here. Because when you produce all the vegetables, cereals, rapeseed for vegetable oil and so on, you get some byproducts that we don't eat currently, at least. And these we then used for feed for pigs and hens. So the byproducts you get is the wheat bran from flour, and bakery waste, whey from making cheese, rapeseed cake from the oil, beet fiber from making sugar and potatoes, some waste, brewer's grain, and then some legume residues. So these are the byproducts that you get out from producing the plant-based foods. But these they don't really make up a good diet for a chicken or a hen or a pig. So we needed to grow some cereals so that we could actually use these byproducts, because otherwise we couldn't really feed any monogastric animals. So that's why we also needed to produce a little bit of grain for these. And we chose to feed these byproducts and the cereals to produce the amounts of eggs that is in the recommended diet, because eggs is the most efficient way of producing animal food from monogastrics. And the rest of the byproducts we fed to pigs, because pigs are better than poultry in using these. Chickens are they need a quite specialized diet. Okay, so the amount that this gave was 3 eggs per week. And that's according to the recommended diet, a little bit less than what is currently consumed. Poultry meat, very little, because we didn't produce any broilers. We just assumed that you would actually eat the hens after they were finished with the laying of the eggs. That's not currently being done in Sweden. I don't know how it is here. We just assume the same, because they're just incinerated in Sweden. So that would mean a drastic reduction. But when it comes to the pig meat, yeah, some reduction, but still quite a lot of pig meat in this diet, because of all the byproducts we got. What we needed to do also was to produce some extra cereals, legumes, and rapeseed oil, and add this to the diet, because we reduced the livestock products. So we needed to add this to the diet in order to provide protein and fat and micronutrients. So, as you can see, an increase in cereal consumption, but also a drastic increase in legumes consumption, because currently we hardly eat any legumes in Sweden, so we would need to increase that a lot, and also some increase in rapeseed oil. And when it comes to the other plant-based foods, the potatoes and roots and tomatoes, fruits, berries, and sugar, we set those according to the recommendations. So the difference from the recommendation is 0, because these are according to this recommended. But compared to the current consumption, we would need to eat less tomatoes, cucumbers, and lettuce. That's mainly water, and more potatoes and roots and fiber-rich vegetables like broccoli and cabbage, and more fruits, more berries, and less sugar. So what would happen to agricultural land in Sweden? How would the land use change now if we were to produce this diet instead? So this is what we grew in 2014. So this blue here at the bottom is the pastures. They would be used just as before. But then you have the lay and the grain. Those are the main crops in Sweden currently. They would be reduced because of less livestock products, and instead we would increase legumes and rapeseed oil and other food crops. And this is mainly apple trees to produce all the fruit that we would need in Sweden. But you can also see that the land, there will also be some land that we will not need to produce this diet. So there will be some spare land when we have produced this diet for the 13.6 million people.
What is in milk?
Yeah, sorry, that's just because I had several scenarios. So this is the diet I'm talking about. It's just, yeah, sorry. I should have changed this now. So we took this spare land then that we have, and we made agriculture self-sufficient in energy. So we produce bioenergy here to run the tractors and the field machinery, and also to produce green mineral fertilizers. So we produced mineral fertilizers using biogas instead of natural gas. So it's just like ordinary mineral fertilizers, just that we don't use a fossil source. We use a renewable feedstock and energy to produce that. And also we produce electricity and heat to, for example, heat the greenhouses for the tomatoes and so on. So agriculture is totally self-sufficient in energy then. So then, moving on to this question now. Now we have the diet. We know how much animal products and what kind of foods we have in the diet. But is it sustainable then? So we used the planetary boundary framework, and I assume that everyone is familiar with that. Yeah? And what we looked at was the climate impact, the biosphere integrity or the biodiversity, the land use, and the flows of nitrogen and phosphorus. We thought that these were less relevant for this agricultural production, and then the fresh water is not a problem in Sweden currently, at least, so we didn't really include that. We have a lot of water. So for climate change, for these in orange here, we quantified the impacts, and I will show you some numbers. When it comes to the biodiversity part, it's really difficult to quantify and say that the production of this diet will cause the extinction of these species. So we thought that since we did make sure that the most vulnerable ecosystems in Sweden, the semi-natural grasslands, are taken care of, so to say, we thought that we had considered this, so we didn't really quantify anything there. So we took the global boundaries, and then we formulated boundary conditions then for this yearly per capita diet. So the global boundary when it comes to land use is that maximum 15% of the global land surface should be converted to cropland. So we took that amount of land and we divided it on the global population. So this is the boundary condition for the diet then, per capita. And when it comes to the climate impact, we started from the concentration level of 350 ppm. And since that's already, we were already way past that, we said that, ideally the production of this diet shouldn't cause any net emissions. And when it comes to nitrogen, we took this amount of nitrogen, that is the boundary condition on the global level. So not more than this should be added through fertilizer and fixation by legumes. So we divided that on the global population and got this number, and the same for phosphorus then. So these are the boundaries conditions that the diet, that the production of this diet needs to stay below. So if we look at what numbers we got, we saw that when it comes to land use, it actually stayed below. We actually had some spare land, as we said. When it comes to the climate impact, although we didn't use any fossil energy or anything like that, there's still some emissions from the ruminants that we have and some nitrous oxide from the farmland that we use. So we're above there. And also we're above when it comes to added nitrogen and added phosphorus. So even though this diet contains a little livestock production, we're still above in several of these. But what we could do is that we could use this spare land here that we have left over, so to say, to sequester carbon, to see if we could, get down to below net zero emissions. But it was still not possible. We came down from 0.32 to 0.18. But of course, this depends a lot on the assumptions you make. How much carbon you can actually sequester there. But it seems still a bit challenging to come down below zero. And when it comes to this nitrogen and phosphorus, we saw that if we could reduce the nitrogen input by 25% and reduce the inputs of phosphorus with 15%, we could get below those boundaries. And I think that could absolutely be possible with better management going forward. So I'm more hopeful with these two then. So, some conclusions. So we saw that we could construct the diet then based on these principles, but of course we would not be able to, would mean drastic reductions in animal protein from this diet. But looking at Sweden, we could protect biodiversity because we take care of our grasslands. The land use is still below the sustainable limit, and I think with greater nitrogen and phosphorus efficiency, we could come down below those boundaries. But still, we would cause some net emissions of greenhouse gases from the production of this diet. So then I think it's just summing up here with I have 2 slides left here. I think we could think about the relevance of this study and this type of diet, because you could say that we don't really have this planned economy, and you can't really, steer production and consumption in this way. So is it really relevant to think in this way? And shouldn't we think of more globalized food system where we just trade everything, and in Sweden we just produce milk and export it to the world and so on? And I think that's an interesting discussion to have. But I think in some ways it is relevant to think about things this way. Because one question that I always get in Sweden, at least when I talk about food systems and the need to change diets and so on, is always this: how much animal protein can we sustainably eat? So when you talk about the need to decrease meat consumption, people want to know, okay, but how much should we eat? And it's really difficult to answer that, of course, but I think if you do like a study like this, where you look at the actual resources that you have and what they can produce, you can find one way of answering this question at least. And now I showed you one scenario. We had 3 scenarios where we looked at different ways of using this grassland and the cropland with different intensities and so on. And should you produce pigs or poultry and so on? So that could help to answer a question like this. So how is Swedish pasture land and byproducts best utilized for food and energy production? Like I showed you here, we chose to grow some cereals on land to be able to feed the pigs, but you could have just, used all the byproducts for bioenergy. That could have been another alternative. And then also looking at what type of plant-based protein can be produced in Sweden, because this would require a lot of legume production, for example, in Sweden. Maybe that could be challenging in a climate, in the Swedish climate, and so on. So what I'm hoping to do next, I think this is an interesting concept, and I would like to make this model much more sophisticated and include things like reindeer herding, like that we have in the north of Sweden, and also include horses that are kept for recreational purposes. Today we don't eat them really, but we could, and that would give some meat, and so on. And you could also think about, for example, the emissions of nitrogen that you have into the Baltic Sea. You could try to capture them by mussel farming, for example, so you can make it all fit together nicely, I think, and it would be interesting to continue to do this if someone wants to fund this. So that's my presentation.
That's great, thank you. Well, that's wonderful, Elin. Thank you very much for starting this series with a very good explanation of, if you take the national level and you look at what you've got in the nation, and the coincidence with the jurisdiction is important.
Yeah.
That there are rules and regulations, there are guidelines which are set by state bodies, so that all is coincident, which is great. So I was thinking, as we go through, could you just apply this to any spatial resolution? Yes, providing there is the rules and the regulations in place. So that's why the national is a good example.